Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for joining us today. Our topic is CTE, the brain disease caused by repeated hits to the head. My guest is Dr. Lee Goldstein, a medical doctor, PhD, and researcher at the Boston University CTE Center. Dr. Goldstein, thank you so much for being here. Great to see you. We appreciate your time.
Oh, a pleasure being with you.
So CTE used to be called punch-drunk syndrome when it was associated with boxers. Then about 8 to 10 years ago, we started associating it with professional football players. You have expanded that and included CTE in association with the military and people who are survivors of domestic abuse. Can you talk briefly about really what CTE is for folks who really don't understand it?
CTE is an abbreviation for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And this is a very serious progressive neurodegenerative disease that is triggered by different injuries to the brain that occur primarily, in our experience, from blast exposure in military veterans or from repetitive hits to the head in contact sports, but not limited to those types of exposures. And that's a very important topic here. And what happens over time is that these repetitive injuries, these repetitive insults to the brain, accumulate, cause damage to the brain, and then trigger a neurodegenerative disease that then progresses over time, even in the absence of further insults. So this can be triggered earlier in life, and with these repetitive insults over time, the disease can be triggered, and then it can progress all the way to dementia and death at the end stage of the disease.
We really want to raise awareness because, as you pointed out, this is not about just professional football players. We had a false sense of security when it was so closely linked to the NFL. This happens, CTE affects regular people, and it's horrifying. It's a terrible thing. Talking about the football players, there was a movie called Concussion that really brought this issue to light among the regular general public. But it was an unfortunate title because really CTE is not necessarily caused by concussions. Can you talk about that?
The disease can be triggered by repetitive head injuries or other types of insults to the brain that do not result in concussion. In fact, we proved this both experimentally in laboratory studies that were conducted at my laboratory at Boston University, but we also had hints of this from our brain bank repository at the Boston University Alzheimer's Disease and CTE Center. The work that's been done both in postmortem brains from people who have had these types of injuries and in experimental laboratory settings, we've been able to show conclusively at this point that the concussion is not a part of the problem here. It's the repetitive head injuries, irregardless of whether there's a concussion or not.
You are also an Alzheimer's expert, and a lot of the symptoms seem to sort of parallel Alzheimer's, but can happen to people who are much younger than typical Alzheimer's patients, right?
That's right. And our work, and my work in particular, combines both my clinical training as a medical doctor with specialty in dementing disorders that include Alzheimer's disease, and also my background experience in laboratory expertise and neuroscience and brain science and experimental neurology. So this is really right at that interface where we've learned that the disease that we know of as CTE does in many ways have some of the hallmarks that we see that we also see in Alzheimer's disease. And that includes even one of the major proteins that's involved in both diseases. That is tau protein, or in this case, an abnormal form of the tau protein that builds up both in Alzheimer's disease and in CTE. They are not the same disease, though. And in fact, we now know that they can co-occur, but in CTE, we know that the symptoms often emerge earlier, far earlier, decades earlier than we would typically see and an Alzheimer's disease patient. And not only that, the distribution in the brain is different. And we know now that it's likely that the pathophysiology, or the way in which the disease is started and spreads, is different as well. So they're distinct disorders. And most importantly, we know that the primary risk factor for CTE is repetitive head injuries. Independent of the type of head injury, we now know that it's about how energy enters into the brain and causes brain injury. And when that's repeated, either by blast exposure or repetitive head impacts, or even by other more exotic means, this can lead to triggering tau pathology that then spreads throughout the brain. At the end of the day, the symptoms can look quite similar, but we know that in younger folks and people who've had these repetitive head injuries, the symptoms are distinct in the early parts of the disease.
So, we've placed so much emphasis on CTE in football players, but when you really think about it, domestic abuse survivors, domestic abuse victims get hit in the head in many cases a lot more often than football players, and without a helmet as well. But, the people perpetrating these crimes and also the victims themselves can often minimize it, say, oh, it's just a slap in the head, I felt fine afterwards. How serious are hits like these to the head when somebody actually hits you with their hand or with an object in the head?
Yes, this has been a concern from very early on, and our laboratory work and also the studies of human brains after people have died, it strongly supported the notion that it's not the manner in which you receive these injuries, but it's the duration and the cumulative number. And if that is true, that any situation in which there are repetitive injuries into the head, or in populations of people who are at risk of this, we know that they're going to be at increased risk for CTE. We also see this in children who are abused repetitively. Right. So this really cuts across a large swath of people who are at risk.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and be right back with Dr. Lee Goldstein, researcher at the Boston University CTE Center. We're talking today about CTE. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We are continuing our discussion with Dr. Lee Goldstein, researcher at the Boston CTE Center. So, Dr. Goldstein, you've established that so many millions of people could be at risk for CTE. Talk about what some of the symptoms are. How would a person, let's say you have been hit in the head many times, what are some of the symptoms?
Right. So, this is one of the areas of very intense research now at our center and elsewhere, trying to diagnose those people who are at risk, whether or not they may be developing the disease. And unfortunately, at the present time, we have no way to definitively diagnose CTE in living persons at this point. However, those people who are at increased risk, we do know that there's a profile of changes that cut across individuals who, in retrospect, have the disease. Now, the symptoms I'm going to describe in just a second here cut across many disorders and are not definitively diagnostic of CTE. So at the moment, we can't sort that out. But some of the changes that we have observed in individuals who have subsequently gone on to develop CTE and has been confirmed by neuropathology include the following. There's a loss of what we call executive function. This is higher order brain coordination of things that we think of as advanced planning, of coordinating multiple activities, multitasking, making decisions that could be influenced by the future, things that we think of as adult mature decisions. often become impaired, and that includes impulse control. So if the front parts of the brain are damaged, as is frequently the case in CTE, we notice more frequently in it's more prominent in men, but that may be just biased from our samples. That is lack of impulse control or impulsivity. There's also commonly a change in the ability to control behavior, but also one's feelings, affect regulation. People become more labile, or they switch from one feeling to another more quickly, and have less ability to control their feelings. They're more labile. That tends to be commonly seen in these as well. And often there's violence with the lack of impulse control, the lack of executive function. This is commonly paired with violence, aggression, hyperemotionality, if you will. And in the setting of substance abuse or mood-altering drugs and access to firearms, for example, this can lead to tragic consequences, and often does.
So you're talking about a change in personality, a change in the way a person thinks and can problem solve, sometimes violence, forgetfulness. It does seem to sort of overlap, as you talked about, some other things like Alzheimer's, PTSD. When we come back, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk further with Dr. Lee Goldstein about what people who suspect they may be suffering from CTE can do. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're talking to CTE expert, Dr. Lee Goldstein. And before the break, you were saying that CTE can only be definitively diagnosed after a person has died. You examine their brains, and that's how you can find out. And you have looked at over 1,000 of these brains at your CTE brain bank. People have donated their brains. Loved ones have donated the brains of people they suspected had CTE. And before they died, their loved ones said they acted so different. They were violent, they were moody, they were confused, they were suicidal, they were homicidal. And then you looked at the brains later and were like, yes, they had a very bad case of CTE, or they had CTE. So talk, Dr. Goldstein, about how important it is to have these donations post-mortem.
Well, the donations are absolutely essential so that we can understand the disease and help our patients. Without knowing what the problem was that was underlying these sorts of changes, the forgetfulness, the changes in behavior, the changes in mood, the changes in personality, and often aggression, violence, homicide, suicide, and the like. Without the brains, we have no way of being able to determine what's going on and what had been going on. And it's often a great relief to the families to find out that their loved one was actually suffering from a terrible degenerative disease. And that goes a long way in the grieving process to helping families repair and heal and understand and have some empathy during their time of grief. So the donations are essential not only for helping the next person down the line who may be at risk for this, but also to help families understand what was going on with their loved one.
So folks who might be interested in donating a brain can go to the CTE. Can you give us the website?
We welcome family members reaching out to us if they're considering donation. They can do so in advance of a death. Mm-hmm. Particularly when there may be evidence of longstanding intimate partner abuse or domestic violence, where we have far fewer individuals who've donated with this type of a background. So we're in really urgent need of people who are so inclined to make that sort of a donation. This is out of tragedy can come a real gift that can help others.
Absolutely. So if you are a person who has been hit in the head many times, you know who you are, or if you know someone, you have a loved one who has suffered a lot of head injuries, it might be a great idea to contact the Boston CTE Center and make arrangements for upon the death, or to donate the brain. You've looked at brains of football players, of military members. Do you have any brains of domestic abuse victims that you can definitely say, yes, they had CTE?
Yes, we do, in fact. A small number. The brain bank currently has somewhere on the order of 1,250 brains, with many more coming in every day. The vast majority of these, all but about 40 or so, are men. About 40 are women, and I believe the numbers are somewhere around 9 or 10 are current or women with documented intimate partner abuse. And in fact, we've seen, not surprisingly, evidence of CTE pathology in some of these brains. This is really, really important because CTE can also co-occur very commonly with depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. This is very common that these all come together. We're trying to understand how these are related, but we also see this in military veterans who've had blast exposure. So teasing that apart can be very complicated, and it's very important for us to be able to do this postmortem. But most importantly, I think, is for anyone who is at risk or is undergoing domestic violence or intimate partner abuse now, is to reach out for help. This is the most important point of all. You must reach out to seek help. There are many people in the community who've dedicated their lives to helping people who are in this situation. It's very common, and it's very difficult to get the help if you don't reach out and try to get it yourself.
But now people know that if they're getting hit in the head repeatedly, that it doesn't go away, that it's not a small thing, and it's not something that goes away the next day. These can have lasting, long-term consequences. So all the more reason to get out. It's easier said than done, we understand. Well, we're going to take one final break and be right back with Dr. Lee Goldstein talking about CTE. Welcome back. We are continuing our discussion with Dr. Lee Goldstein about CTE. So, Dr. Goldstein, what should people do if they have been hit in the head many times? What's your advice to them now?
Well, without a doubt, the most important thing is not to get hit in the head or anywhere else ever again. This is really the thing that we know for certain, that the more hits to the head, the worse it is for your brain. This is no surprise. And most importantly, people shouldn't be getting hit in the head in a domestic or intimate partner situation, regardless. So the most important thing is to protect yourself and your loved ones and reach out to get help. This is just so important to protect your brain, your family, your relationships, and most importantly, yourself.
And regarding CTE, do you think that there is going to be a test in the future where people who are living can now be determined whether or not they have CTE?
We are very actively working on this. We have new imaging techniques that we've developed and published to look at this directly. There are other blood tests that are being developed, and I think we are developing a profile that will allow us to at least determine who's at greater risk for developing the disease in the setting of folks who've had repetitive head injury exposures. So I think we're getting very close to being able to do that, and in fact, we may also have treatments in the not too distant future. We and others are working on various ways to stop the progression of the disease. But again, I just want to underscore the major way to do this and to prevent CTE is not to get hit. And if you have been hit, not to be hit again. And so that's something under all of our control right now.
And if you have been hit in the head a number of times, are there any lifestyle choices that you can make to mitigate these injuries? For example, we hear things about fish oil, drugs or alcohol, sleep, nutrition. Do any of those things help?
The data is, we really don't have the data for that yet. But what we do know, what we absolutely do know and have indisputable proof, is that the longer the duration of the repetitive head injuries, the greater the risk of the disease. This we know indisputably. And so the thing that we know works now to reduce further risk of the disease is to prevent further injury. And we know that those folks who've had repetitive injuries, either in domestic violence situations or in contact sports or in the military, the absolute surefire way to prevent increasing risks further is to prevent further exposure.
And one final question, Dr. Goldstein. You know, we talked about maybe misdiagnoses where you might be diagnosed with PTSD when you really actually have CTE. You might be diagnosed with, for example, depression when really what you have is CTE. And so people should maybe not be so discouraged if they're in therapy for these things and they're not getting better, right?
Well, I think what we also know from our studies to date is that these disorders commonly occur together. So, and they can work together to make each of the individual disorders worse. So we commonly see PTSD, depression, and CTE occurring in people in middle age when we would not commonly see the co-occurrence of those three things. So the point is that if you're in treatment for one, it certainly will be made worse by an ongoing CTE process. And again, the way to prevent to reduce that risk further is to prevent further injuries to the brain.
Well, Dr. Goldstein, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for your amazing work at the Boston University CTE Center. And if people want more information, they can contact the BU CTE Center, including brain donations, which are always wonderful and greatly appreciated and advance our understanding of this awful disease. So thank you again for being with us. Great to see you.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to you for joining us for this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.